Howdy of you delicious people. I'm here to review the last 4 episodes of season 4 of The Last Man on Earth. So, I did not check, I did not Google if this show got canceled or if it got renewed or not. It seems like the very tail end of this season is to tell us that this show is to get renewed and to showcase that it's going to transition into some story. But I could also say, in all brutal honesty, these episodes, even though there is a closure moment within these episodes, we do get a person to come back, which is to make a lot of people happy. We end up having, seemingly to me, episodes that metaphorically don't exactly go anywhere. We end up having, at some point, our main character, Tandy, mentioning how every single season is to end. To us. Telling us, yeah, they always need to be able to transition from place to place to place to place at every single end of every single season. So we go on to have certain characters have story within here, but we are also going to the exact same well for a number of characters. We're kind of trading stories for certain characters. What had happened to Tandy is kind of what's happening to Todd. We're also kind of regurgitating some stuff that happened in previous seasons and previous episodes and kind of replaying them here to have this be a like, hey guys, we're really running out of story here. We're really running out of stuff to do. And it shows. It blatantly shows. I could be impressed or I could enjoy some of the ride that we get within these episodes. But man, is my patience drying thin also. How many times are we going to go to the same well? And also, how many times are we also going to bring up a song that was heavily used in one episode? Hey guys, let's bring it back. How many times are we going to bring up the same old song and dance? Through every little bit of this show, it kind of gets to the point where once you've seen the earliest of episodes, it kind of gets to the point where you would rather just, well, I'll just watch the early episodes on rerun, because that's basically what you're getting in the later seasons, is a rerun like variety. I understand that maybe these episodes would probably have been better watching them like via a weekly thing than spamming them all together, but that's just the way of which that I'm going about doing this. When watching a show like Smallville, and I'm trying to compare Smallville to this show, when watching numerous seasons of Smallville all in one real repetitious like way, I started to notice that, man, every single episode goes the exact same direction. Clark Kent ultimately ends up getting upset about something. He ends up running to Lex, accusing Lex of something. Lex ultimately goes, "No, that wasn't me," and then Clark has to go and figure out where or what the real true problem is in the episode. But I would start to see that pattern emerge through every single episode, and I would start to see that kind of pattern. And so when going into this show, I'm starting to see a pattern emerge of, okay, the writing is getting a way more flimsy. It kind of seems at some point that they are trying to experiment a little or kind of do childish like jokes, which some people can find fun. I'm not saying that this show isn't fun anymore. I'm just saying that the show kind of feels even more kind of flimsy as far as writing goes than it was before. If in the early seasons it was mostly like experimenting and doing kind of like weird or bizarre stuff to buy time, we end up having it to where in these 4 episodes we're having characters go into certain directions that feel heavily familiar. So let's go into here and let's go into spoilers. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil these episodes. So Todd is to have extreme baby fever. We have to where Todd is approaching Erica and treating this baby making thing as a transaction, and everything of which that he is to mention about how they're going to go about this sounds very much of a turnoff, or very much of a like, God, like, could you just not even like mention whatever you're going to mention? This is making this severely awkward. So we have it to where Erica is kind of getting severely annoyed by this entire group, to where I was thinking at some point Erica was going to leave the group and try and like make it on her own, bringing along Gail with her, because those two are of course a couple now. We have Erica going and drinking wine, and Todd is looking at her and is like, "You're drinking wine?" Every little thing that Erica does is being scrutinized and being looked over, to the point of Todd trying to find out whether or not Erica is having her period or not. I'm going to pause here for a second. So Erica is to be consistently watched over. Melissa is to come in to try and be Erica's best friend. And if anything, really, Melissa is being so awkward and so uncomfortable to Erica, to where Todd is realizing how much Erica is eventually going to blow up at some point. So Todd ends up going to apologize to Erica and really just say that, you know what, I think we should call this off. This all was a mistake. I realize how much I'm pushing you, and I'm sorry. By that time, we find out that Erica is pregnant, and Todd all of a sudden starts crying because he's like, "Oh my God, I'm so happy." But he's also just kind of upset for how he has kind of been with Erica because he's starting to realize that he's like, well, what if I'm going to be this way when I'm going to be a father? Just kind of to the point to where his son or daughter will quite possibly hate him. I don't know. So, moving on. At one point within these episodes, we eventually have it to where Melissa and Gail are not quite pitching in with the group, not doing any of the chores or any of the tasks. So Melissa and Gail make up that they're going out to go and search and find for food because eventually resources are going to be slim pickings. So what they end up doing instead is they end up going and firing off some rounds and just kind of sticking around in one place to not go shopping anywhere, not to do anything. And so we end up having both Melissa and Gail coming back to this environment to say, hey, you know what, guys? Why did you steal all of our food that we spent hours trying to go and scavenge for? Which, when hearing this, I was just like, that is kind of the stupidest excuse to have of basically saying that somebody had taken all our food right as they were to have delivered it. We end up having Todd going and crying to say how difficult Erica's life has been and so on and so forth, crying his way to get sympathy, to have both Gail and Melissa go and say, okay, let's really go out and do our chores, let's really go out and help. While they are to go and walk away, Todd is to go, ha 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 ha, yeah, I got them to do what I wanted them to do, ha ha ha, like, yeah, suckered them into doing it. So, and at some point here, we ended up having Todd go into the same room which Tandy had gone into before to try to produce a baby, or try to produce a positive test for his man juice count, let's just say. So we had Todd in this room full of seemingly unattractive men, where before Tandy was filled in a room with unattractive, women, to maybe quite possibly Tandy. And so we had Todd having to produce a sample to go to Erica, and that created a baby. So we have seemingly Tandy going and sleeping one day and waking up to realize that half of his head is gone, hair-wise. So we have Tandy scrambling around his house like it's Christmas to see locks of hair, to eventually see a note, to lead him to finding out that Mike is still alive. Which ultimately I was like, yay, like closure, but yay, Mike is back. But also when I am to realize that Mike is back, I'm like, okay, we're gonna go and get that stupid song played over and over and over again. But it seems like they are trying to transition a little bit of music going into here to where they're trying to mix it up a tiny bit. But when looking at it, we're going right back into that same old song that they have to sing over and over and over again. But we do end up having Tandy and Carol trying to karaoke, and we end up having Carol not singing the song whatsoever. If anything, she ends up singing the lyrics to a song that they were supposed to sing in a different tone, and then she ends up just going and reading the lyrics to see what happens within the song, while Tandy is to walk off to go and do something. And I was like, all right, like, this is actually pretty good. I like this switching up of, one, having someone else try to do the song, do a song, but then not even realizing what to do or how the whole thing entails. And I thought that that was really funny. I also found it funny, even though it's kind of going back to that same old well. We end up having Mike being reintroduced via the group, via Tandy, because Tandy ends up going and taking the entire group out to see Mike, and because ultimately, because the group wasn't aware that Mike was there, I guess. So we have Mike, who ends up surprising the group, and Gale ends up shooting him full of bullets, but we end up finding out that, of course, the gun had blanks in it, bringing back to the exact same joke that happened with Carl previously. And I'm just like, okay, so is it going to be to the point to where there's not going to actually be blanks in that gun and someone is going to actually die to have that joke be finally just, oh, my bad. I'm waiting for that moment. And ultimately, if this show is to be canceled, then that moment is never going to come. So, pushing on. So, we find out that Mike has all kinds of NASA, whatever, equipment to find out that there seemingly is a giant heat signature of people in one place. Ultimately, having it to where the episode is to be called The Blob. So we have it to where Mike is wanting them to go on their way to find whatever this heat signature is. And so while Mike and Tandy are going on their adventure, we have it to where Todd is starting to realize that there is really something going on within the home of which they are living in. We end up finding out that seemingly this entire home is seemingly booby-trapped to the gills. We end up finding out that Todd had found a seemingly wall that has a plethora of dead bodies within it, as well as also finding out that seems there are a number of things that are in this home that they are just to now find out are booby-trapped. We find a piano that ultimately has a bomb within it. We end up finding out there is a secret room that has a plethora of guns and grenades and all kinds of things, tons and tons of ammo, and so on and so forth. We also have Tandy, who creates some mad scientist stuffed dog head / robot contraption, to where, since Tandy could not find an actual dog, he needed to make a robotic one. And so this robotic dog ends up going and detonating the piano explosive. So when Tandy and Mike are to go off to this location where there seemingly is a giant heat signature like thing going on, they end up finding out that it seems to be just some mountain or uh, some mountain of sorts that is giving off, I would assess, some heat signature. Or maybe there are people actually inside said mountain. We are very unsure. Hence why I noticed towards the tail end of this where there's a group of gas masked individuals. So we have it to where Mike and Tandy are making the consensus, hey man, how about we take the entire group and then just live here? We live right here. Roll to me, there seems to be a ton of fruit and oranges, and there seems to be a ton of food, but also there seems to be a ton of live goats that are all around this area. And so there isn't legitimately a home that seems to be present within this location, but that doesn't stop them from wanting to go and retrieve a train trolley of sorts to attach onto their truck to have them have a quasi home like thing. So we have, when Tandy and Phil come back, the group goes on to this road trip with this train trolley-ish like thing attached to this truck to move them on into this location of course, oranges and goats and so on and so forth. And we end up having this group, one, realizing how often they have to move from place to place to place to place, but they are also starting to realize that they are also not alone. Realizing that it seems that there are gas masked individuals that are eventually going to cause a threat to Tandy and his people, but knowing full well how this show tends to end, I'm assuming all of these gas masked individuals are all going to be accidentally gunned down somehow and killed. And when looking at it also, we have completely and utterly forgotten whatever happened to Pamela and Glenn. I'm still asking, whatever ended up happening to those people? Was there something I missed? Was there a scene somewhere where they had died? I'm confused at this point and juncture now into the show. So I really did like the fact that we are keeping on a pattern of having this group moving somewhere. It seems that when they are to move somewhere, it seems that we are getting to a smaller and smaller number of items that this group is to have with them. But when looking at it also, these characters are desperately running out of resources. To see Carol opening a can that seems to be shooting out at her, I thought was hilarious. Also, Carol ended up making she's trying to make this food that looks like the most either disgusting or bizarre looking things, mixing in food color and all kinds of odd bizarre things. When they are to eat into this, they're like it's freaking hilarious. So we have seemingly Tandy and Phil finding goats, and so they are to bring these goats to both or to all the group. And as soon as they bring in these goats, goats run off. It's like, of course they do. They spent an entire, like, seemingly 10 to 20 minutes trying to retrieve certain genders of goats, all while also having a conversation about what Mike is going to exactly do now. Because we end up having it to where Mike is trying to be a much more driven character because ultimately, or because he doesn't want to be alone. He doesn't want to be. He feels. I think Mike still feels like he is on that satellite. He is still in space. He still feels alone. I think his desperate mission to find more people because he is fine or still alive, and he has to make sense out of every single thing of how he came back to Phil and everyone. Excuse me. We have Mike going and mentioning he didn't get the virus. He was sick because he was in space for far too long and then came back to the surface, and that's the reason why he was sick, bizarrely. We have it to where Mike mentions how he came back was just basically pure luck. Because Tandy actually gave him a note of where exactly they were going to be, and Mike never read it. Mike blatantly said, "Yeah, I didn't read the note," telling me exactly where you guys are going to be. And I honestly thought that was actually hilarious. And I'm assuming that's what Tandy did when Tandy was talking to Lewis, mentioning that he was going to go off to talk to Mike, to ultimately to eventually leave him a note to say, "Hey, we're leaving." So I thought that was really interesting how they eventually ended up transitioning towards the tail end of this episode. I would say if this is the end, if this is done, if we are to say that this show was canceled or whatever, I enjoyed this show. It was an enjoyable show. I really liked it. I would honestly say, though, that for a lot of shows, you tend to really latch on to the early seasons. You really do. It's hard to eventually keep writing for a show like this, so I can understand the difficulty in writing this show compared to any other. Because most of the episode feels random, even though they're going back to the same old well a lot. Meaning that, like, as far as the writing goes, the writing isn't random. It's the improvisation that a lot of the actors just chuck in there because they're like, well, I want a line this week. I want a story this week. There was a lot of times where I would bicker and I would moan about how I felt that there were some characters that never got their time in the sun, but then eventually we would eventually get full circle to eventually getting to these people. It just takes a long time. Plus, we have certain characters that are taking up a lot of time, screen time. Ultimately, aka Phil, Ultimately, aka Tandy, because he basically created the entire show. So why wouldn't he be the guy that's getting most of the lines, or the guy who's orchestrating the entire story? It's basically like Family Guy with with uh, Seth MacFarlane. It's the same thing where it's like the guy's going to get top billing because he's the guy that created the whole thing. So, and I just realized that when looking at the credits towards the show. So, I think that's all I wanted to say about these quite possibly last episodes. Yeah, I apologize if really I either if this show gets renewed and then people are like, oh, I thought this show was gonna get canceled, or vice versa, because I don't know. I didn't look it up. I didn't bother to. Because realistically, I just say, well, if this is it, then sailing off to the sunset. If not, then I will be welcomed to continue to watch this show. It seems that people at some points are interested in this show, and so I thank you. But other than that, I think it's time to call this one a wrap. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.